Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover the Education of Cyrus. This is also known as the Cyropedia, and it's by Greek historian Xenophon. This is from book 19 for my 2025 reading list. Well, the Education of Cyrus, the Cyrus we're talking about here is Cyrus the Great. He lived from 600 to 530 BC, and he ruled the Persian Empire between 559 and 530 BC. He is the Cyrus that we come across in the Old Testament. And in the book of Isaiah, there's a line that says, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him." End quote. That's from Isaiah 45. That's not in the book we're talking about today, but just if you're familiar with that part of the Old Testament, Cyrus is the ruler who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So that's the Cyrus we're talking about here. It's also the Cyrus of the Cyrus cylinder, if you've seen that in the British Museum, famous artifact. And so what's interesting here is Xenophon, the author, lived a lot later than Cyrus the Great. So Xenophon lived from 430 to 354 BC, and his main works, or his most notable works, are works of history. And so I covered one of those last week, the Anabasis, and then he wrote Hellenika, and I covered that quite a while ago. I read that last year. And so we know him as this historian, and then and even with those works, especially the Anabasis, he was a main participant in that, and so he's writing about himself in the third person, but he's there. But this Education of Cyrus work, this is 160 years after the death of Cyrus, where Xenophon is writing this. He wrote this around 370 BC. So what's going on here? Is this a historical account with that amount of years in between when Xenophon is writing it and when Cyrus the Great actually lived? Are there historical elements? Are there things that are true about it, but then things that are fictional? And what I came to find out is that there is a mix. And so a lot of the battles that are portrayed, a lot of the kind of main events in the life of Cyrus show up in this work, but it's a largely fictional account of the life of Cyrus. And in fact, Xenophon is trying to get points across, kind of political ideas, leadership ideas, wisdom, literature. It has more of that kind of a feel. It almost reads like a novel. It's very exciting. There's a lot going on. There's an arc to the story. It's the Education of Cyrus, but it takes you from his childhood all the way to his death, and then even slightly beyond that. How we see what his two sons do after he passes away. And so there's just kind of an interesting way that this is put forward. And I'm going to get into that more in this episode, just because it was a question I had the entire time of reading this work, of how close it was to reality, or was this kind of made up? Was Xenophon just trying to get certain points across? So I want to contrast Cyrus here with the Cyrus that I talked about last week from the Anabasis, and that's Cyrus the Younger that we talked about last week. This is Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus the Younger was 424 to 401 BC. Cyrus the Great, again, is 600 to 530. So quite a bit before Cyrus the Younger. But Xenophon was with Cyrus the Younger. He knew him, and we get some of that information in Anabasis. And so I like to think that Xenophon kind of had an inside scoop on the history of Persia, just being in Persia for so long during the Anabasis, and knowing Cyrus, and perhaps some of these stories were passed down about Cyrus the Great, and maybe they made their way into the Education of Cyrus here. But for all intents and purposes, this is largely a fictionalized account of the life of Cyrus the Great. But Xenophon does a lot in this book, and he kicks off the entire work by presenting a problem. There's almost like an introduction to this work, and the problem goes about like this. It is easier, given his nature, for a human being to rule all the other kinds of animals than to rule human beings. But when we reflected that there was Cyrus, a Persian, who acquired very many people, very many cities, and very many nations, all obedient to himself, we were thus compelled to change our mind to the view that ruling human beings does not belong among those tasks that are impossible, or even among those that are difficult, if one does it with knowledge. End quote. So here we have the problem. The problem is it's very hard for human beings to rule other human beings. It naturally places them in two groups. You've got the ruled and you've got the rulers. And so that creates animosity. And so how do you handle that? It's much easier to rule over animals, but when you talk about human beings, it's a different ballgame. And so Xenophon immediately says, but when we reflect on the life of Cyrus. And so that's what this book is. It's a reflection on the life of Cyrus in relation to that initial problem that is mentioned, of the problem of ruling other people. And so at the end of this section, so this is chapter 1 in book 1, Xenophon writes this: so on the grounds that this man was worthy of wonder, and again, Cyrus would be this man, on the grounds that this man was worthy of wonder, we examined who he was by birth, what his nature was, and with what education he was brought up, such that he so excelled in ruling human beings. Whatever we have learned, therefore, and think we have perceived about him, we shall try to relate. And I'll end the quote there. I don't know who the we was there, because this is Xenophon writing this, but He says, this is what we're going to relate. We're going to look at the life of Cyrus, and then we're going to relate what we see. And so in this work, we follow the education of Cyrus. But the education is really, it's kind of a way of thinking of the preparation of Cyrus for what he did in his life. And so we see him learning from his grandfather. We see him learning from all these different people in the book, but it's really in preparation for who he became. And then if we take the view that Xenophon is writing this as kind of a teacher, almost like a book of moral instruction, it becomes a way that he can put words into other people's mouths on educating the future leader of Persia. And so we follow Cyrus from his youth to getting his first big duties. He's called on to go to Armenia and get the king there on board with joining the Persians in battle. He eventually leads a battle against the Babylonians, and then he ends up leading this extensive Persian empire. And we even learn what happens afterwards when his sons take power and things go to the worse. So just an interesting, you see the whole arc of his life, but the reason it's called the Education of Cyrus is it's almost the preparation for Cyrus in what he will do later on in life. As for my initial response, at first when I started reading this, it's maybe a weird thing to say, but I felt like I was getting secret information. Like there were so many great lines, so many great ideas and insights that it had this feeling of wisdom literature, but just like really key points and really important things to consider. And I'll highlight some of those in the next segment. But just on things like leadership and practical ideas, this book had a ton of those. It became a slog at times, but most of the other points of the book, it was exciting. And then you'd get into these battle scenes and kind of back and forth dialogue with different people. And it picked up a lot then. But it does read a lot more like a novel than it does a historical account. The version I read was a translation by Wayne Ambler. And so he translated it. There were a number of annotations, and then he also wrote the introduction. And it's a work put out by Cornell University Press. There's also a 2-volume Loeb edition. So those are those small green books. You get like books 1 through 3 in the first one, and then 4 through 6 in the second one. I believe that's the case with the Loeb. Actually, there's 8 books, so it's probably split up 4 and 4. There's not really other ones like Penguin and Oxford University Press. They usually have versions of these old works, but they don't have this one, so that was kind of surprising. But the main one I always see is it's this light blue cover, and that's the one that I read by Cornell University Press. As a side note, Thomas Jefferson was said to have had this work, The Education of Cyrus, and he apparently liked it. As a first-time reader, I wish the introduction of this book had been a little more exhaustive. It more kind of highlights what the work was about as opposed to what the work was. So in the sense of how did Xenophon know about all of this? And was it true? That was a big question I had throughout the book, and I had to look other places to find that out. So I wish the introduction would have gone into that a little bit. And then the other question I had is just throughout this book, Cyrus will be talking and he'll say like, by Zeus or by Hera, and he'll pray to the Greek gods. And that just struck me as odd. I didn't think the Persians worshipped the Greek gods or acknowledged them, and yet over and over, you have Cyrus like sacrificing to the Greek gods, and he would sacrifice to other gods as well, but over and over it was to the Greek gods. And I just kept thinking like something's off here. Like why does Xenophon have him sacrificing to the Greek gods or addressing the Greek gods. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later as well and what I found out about that. But that was not addressed in the introduction, but it just kind of a question I had throughout the book. So for the final two segments of this episode, I will cover just things that stuck out in the work. And then in segment 3, the final segment, I'll cover the one thing that stood out the most in the Education of Cyrus. All right, so I have 3 main areas I want to cover in this segment of things that stuck out. And the first is just the wise rule of Cyrus as presented in this work. The second thing is a story of love that was quite entertaining in this book. And then the third part here, I want to just highlight the answers to those questions I just addressed about, is this work true? Is it fictional? And then what about the worship of the Greek gods that is presented over and over again? Was that real? What was going on there? So let's start off with wise rule. I just want to highlight some things that I thought were very interesting as I read this work. So some of these I will describe, others I'll read, and then others I'll do kind of a mix of both. So the first one is just the nature of Cyrus as he's presented in this work. And when he's very young, he takes part in different games and in different contests and contests on horseback. He loved horses and he loved doing battle on horses, but then also hunting from horse and all that. And so he was doing this contest, and Xenophon writes here that when defeated, he would laugh at himself most vigorously. He did not run from being defeated into the refuge of not doing that in which he had been defeated. Rather, he immersed himself in trying to do better the next time, end quote. And this, we see it over and over about Cyrus, that just in his nature, like he was more concerned about getting better at something as opposed to appearing to do things right all the time. Like he really wanted to learn about things. He wanted to gain that wisdom and then be able to use that. And so obviously ties in closely with the title of this work, of the Education of Cyrus. He was a man who wanted to be educated. There wasn't this battle of desiring knowledge, or he was okay with appearing dumb or appearing as losing in a contest in order to get better. And that was a neat thing that kept showing up over and over. Another thing kind of dealing with that intro that I mentioned in segment 1 about political rule, just naturally dividing people into the ruled versus the rulers. And this comes up a lot. And so this is one statement that shows up. I think that the ruler ought to differ from the ruled, not by his living easily, but by taking forethought and by being enthusiastic in his love of labor, end quote. So this is Cyrus speaking, and he said, the ruler should not be distinguished from the ruled in the sense of living easy and taking the good life and eating all the food and drinking all the wine, but instead should be the most enthusiastic in his love of labor. And so just again, kind of things that the ruler should do on purpose to not be as separated from the ruled. And again, this is another idea that shows up over and over in this work. Another thing is contest. And so we saw the first thing I mentioned that Cyrus didn't mind losing contests, but throughout the rest of his life, you see him initiating contests. And he did this a lot for preparing men for battle. And so he wanted there to be experiences like hunting that would prepare one for war. So he would go out hunting and he would try to take the generals with him and they would hunt by horseback. So they would get used to pursuing something on a horse. They'd get used to spearing an animal from a horse. And all these things would help in preparation for battle, but he would just do these contests and always have prizes for the top, the winners and just turn everything into a game. And it was a neat thing to see that. And so the statement that comes up on that is human beings are much more willing to practice things in which there are rivalries, end quote. So you see that quote just captures things so well because one, Cyrus wants to make things fun, wants to make it to where people are more willing to practice things. But then he also wants to create these experiences for people to get better at what they're doing. Now, the next one is a section on being trustworthy to friends. And this is a neat thing that he says here. So I'm gonna read this. You also know that this golden scepter is not what preserves the kingship. Rather, trustworthy friends are the truest and safest scepter for kings. Do not believe that human beings are born trustworthy by nature. But each person needs to make people trustworthy to himself. The acquisition of trustworthy people is in no way possible by force, however, but rather by benefaction. And I'll stop reading it there. But a good comment here on leadership, that it does not, the golden scepter is not what preserves the kingship. So just this, having the fittings of being a king, that's not what makes you a king or keeps you being a king. He says, rather, trustworthy friends are the truest and safest scepter for kings. And then he said, the other part about that is you can't get trustworthy friends by force. So it forces the leader to be a benefactor to friends and to treat them kindly. And you see this throughout Cyrus's life as presented by Xenophon here. He's constantly thinking of others. He's constantly giving gifts. If he has food at the table, he's giving it to others. If he has excess of food, he is giving that to his generals, his people that he saw do something well. Like he wants to award people based upon their merit. And so he's constantly giving things away to other people. And this ties in with my last thing that I want to highlight here under the wise rule section. And this is just a fantastic section where Cyrus is talking to Croesus. And Croesus asks Cyrus, how much money do you have in your treasury? And Cyrus says, this, come, Croesus, send a man whom you trust in the highest, along with Hystaspas here. Hystaspas, go around to my friend and tell them that I need gold for a certain action, for I really do need some more. Order them each to write down how much money they are able to provide me, to put the seal on their letter, and to give it to Croesus' servant to carry here. And I'm going to stop reading there. Let me just give a little bit more background to that story. So Croesus wants to know how much money Cyrus has in the treasury, and he gets... a number is given of what Croesus thinks Cyrus should have in the treasury by this point in his rule. And Cyrus says, I don't have that money in the treasury. And it ties into what I mentioned about trustworthy friends. Cyrus would give a lot of this money away to friends. And you can view it cynically as he's trying to buy friendships and that kind of thing. Or you can view it in a way of being a wise ruler, of giving these gifts to people and honoring them for good things that he did. But either way, so Croesus now has this number in his head of, okay, this is how much Cyrus should have in his treasury based upon his battles and all that. And Cyrus's point is he sends his person to go around to his friends and say, I need money for this. How much can you give me? And the number after that is collected, the number that is brought back to Cyrus is more than what Croesus thought Cyrus should have had in his treasury. And so the point there is that Cyrus, by doing these good things for others, it actually benefits him more. It gives him more money than what Croesus thought he should have in his treasury. And it's just such a neat story and really goes in well with how we see Cyrus behaving with others throughout the work. So let me read just a few more parts in this part about the treasury. Croesus found that there was many times as much as he had told Cyrus he would now have in his treasuries if he gathered it together. And then a little bit later, I, on the other hand, make these friends of mine wealthy and believe that they are treasuries, and at the same time that they are more trustworthy guards both of myself and of our good things than if I appointed garrisons of mercenaries. End quote. So again, there, just the view of treasury. You could get this money, you could get this gold, you could just kind of store it away in a safe part of the castle, a safe part of the kingdom, or you could feed it out to the friends. But if they're trustworthy friends, you'll almost get a return on that investment. And just an interesting way and neat way to think about it. All right, the second thing here that really stuck out to me, I want to talk about the love story that is presented, and it's rather humorous here. So Cyrus is talking to a young man named Anabasis, and so Cyrus is older at this point, and so here is the youth. Here is Anabasis talking to Cyrus. Do you think, Cyrus, that the beauty of a human being is sufficient to compel one who does not wish to act contrary to what is best? I'll stop reading there. So this young person comes up to Cyrus. Do you think beauty of a human being it can compel someone to act contrary to what they know is best for them? And Cyrus says, yes, of course. And in this young man, he continues on. He says, for fear and law are sufficient to prevent love. And so here we have this young man saying that fear and law, they can prevent people from falling in love. And then he continues on saying, no law would have the power to bring human beings to obey these things, for they are naturally overcome by them. But loving is voluntary. And so you just get this sense there's this young man spouting off these things he thinks are true, and Cyrus is just kind of, sitting back chuckling. And so Cyrus says this, how then, if falling in love is voluntary, is it not possible to stop when one wishes? And that throws Anabasis for a loop. And Cyrus continues, I advise you, Anabasis, not to allow your sight to linger upon beautiful people, because fire burns those who touch it. But beautiful people ignite even those who gaze from afar, so that they are inflamed by love. And then you read a little bit further down on that page, and the youth saw that the woman was beautiful, perceived her nobility and goodness, was attentive to her, and thought he thereby gratified her, perceived that she was not without gratitude, and that she took care through her own servants that he have what he needed when he came, and that he would need nothing if he ever fell sick. From all this, he was captured by love. So Anabasis has these ideals that he's above love. He won't fall for this. And then you see him a page later, he falls for it. And then we come across Anabasis 40 pages later, and here is what we find out about him. Cyrus, when Cyrus heard that he had fallen in love, he laughed at the one who had professed to be stronger than love. And then a little further down, I see, Eraspis, he said, that you are afraid of me and are terribly ashamed. Cease being so. I hear that the gods are overcome by love, and I know that human beings, even those seeming to be very prudent, have suffered similarly from love. End quote. So here you've got this young man kind of going full circle, says he's not going to fall in love, falls in love, gets scared that Cyrus may punish him 40 pages later, and then Cyrus just kind of goes to him and, see, you can't even fight against love. And it's a theme we see over and over in Greek literature, that even the gods succumb to Eros, the god of love. And so this was just kind of a funny little story within the Education of Cyrus. All right, now the third part of this, the things that stuck out. So the answers to my questions, and again, my questions were: did this happen? Is it true? Or is this Xenophon kind of making things up to get his points across? And so what I did after reading this book, because this was not in the introduction, or I didn't get the answer to that here, but when I looked it up, it seems that this is a mostly fictional account. Some people even called it a novel, even though novels don't really show up until Don Quixote. That's usually considered to be the first novel. That's 15 or 1600s, but some people kind of consider this to be novel-like, and I can see how that could be the case. But there are elements that are true, where you've got the battle against Babylon, and that sort of thing. But I guess most of the other things that happen are fictional. And then the Persians did not worship the same gods as the Greeks, even though this book is throughout. You're seeing Zeus mentioned, you're seeing Hera mentioned, you're seeing other gods, Greek gods mentioned. But that, in a way, that kind of degraded the book for me, just because it made me then question the entire book. Like, if you're putting words into Cyrus's mouth about the gods, something that is so basic in the sense of the Persians would not have talked about these gods. Like, why would you do that? Maybe it was to show that this is a fictional account. And if that's the case, so be it. But, I just going in, I kind of wish I would have known what the genre was of this book. At first, I kind of thought it was history, just because the other two works that I had read by Xenophon were historical works. But this one was not, and I guess I just wasn't prepared for it. So there are still valuable details and information, and I enjoyed the book. I just didn't know going into it what kind of book it was. So let me go now into segment 3 up next, where I cover the one thing that stood out in the Education of Cyrus. All right, now on to the one thing. So the one thing, this is part of how I try to remember what I read. I think of one thing from the book that stood out. So in a book like this, it may be the thing that I could picture the most in my head while I was reading it. It might be the thing I hope to remember the most. It might be a lesson that just really, right when I saw it or right when I read something in the book, it just startled me, or it was so different from what I think usually. In this case, it was something that I pictured in my head when I was reading it. It was such an incredible story that this is the thing that sticks out to me most from this work, and it's the Babylonian conquest. And so the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire. If you know the history in the Old Testament, the Jews living in Judah, they were exiled by the Babylonians to Babylon. And then the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and then those Jews went to Persia. And then that's where I mentioned in segment 1, where Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, to return to Judah, to rebuild the temple. And so we get in this work, we get to see where Cyrus is conquering the Babylonians, where the king gets killed, the Babylonian king gets killed, where the final battle takes place in that, and so this happens in book 7 of this work, and in chapter 5 of that book of the Education of Cyrus, and it was really exciting. And I may have heard this story in the past, but I didn't remember it, and just kind of getting some of the details. And this appears to be one of those things that were were valid. Like this happened, as opposed to a lot of the dialogue in the book was probably just made up by Xenophon. So let me read different parts, or actually let me set up the story here and then I'll read the different parts. So the Persians have this citadel of the Babylonians surrounded, and they're leading a siege now. So they're waiting it out, hoping the people inside kind of starve and get to the point where they just come out, give up, and then that ends things. But we get the sense that the Babylonians are laughing at the Persians, and here's why. This then is what they were doing. Those in the fortress were laughing at the siege on the grounds that they had provisions for more than 20 years. And the quote there. So the people who are in the fortress, the people who are in the Babylonians, they are looking at the Persians who are trying to attack them, and they're laughing because they have food for 20 years. They're going to be fine. And there is a river that runs through Babylon. There's the Euphrates River. So they're fine. They've got water. They've got food for 20 years. They're going to be okay. They'll probably last longer than these Persians waiting outside the gates, or so they think. But Cyrus starts planning and starts thinking, and he starts building a trench around the fortress. And so let me continue reading. The trenches had already been dug. Since Cyrus heard that there was a festival in Babylon in which all the Babylonians drank and reveled the entire night, on this night, as soon as it was dark, he took many people and opened the mouths of the trenches toward the river. When this was done, the water traveled down through the trenches during the night, and the path of the river through the city became passable for human beings. End quote. So what happens there is this is a walled off fortress. Like there's no way the Persians are getting in, but there's a river, that Euphrates River, that runs right through Babylon, and you can't it's the river, so you can't use that to get into the city. But by diverting the water into these trenches, it basically creates a dry land where this river was, and then the Persian army can just march right kind of under the walls where the river was, right into the city. And that's what they do. And Cyrus waits until it's a night where they're drinking all night, and does this at night. And then they walk right into the city, and it says, "Men, friends, the river has yielded us the road to the city." And then they go in, they find the king, they kill the king. And this is how the Persians take over the Babylonian Empire. So just a very vivid picture, and you just picture this river kind of drying up as they divert the water, and but the people in the fortress laughing, thinking that they're safe. It was quite the story and quite the build up, but just again shows a lot of what Cyrus was like, and his wisdom and his military prowess. In conclusion, I enjoyed many parts of this book. It did become a slog at times, but overall it was really good. And the wisdom, the battle scenes, there was a lot of really good stuff in this work. It's not as well known of a work by Xenophon as Anabasis and Hellenika. And then he's written another one. He wrote one about Socrates. So he's got some other books that are a lot more famous than this one, but I'm really glad I read this one. This will be my final work of Greek history that I read. I read Herodotus, Thucydides, and then these three works by Xenophon. I wish I had gone into it knowing what the genres it was. I think that just would have helped me and understand what was going on, because it almost became a letdown, because I thought it was a work of history, but then it just began to question things like, how did Xenophon know this? Why is he putting the names of the Greek gods in the mouths of the Persians? And then it was just kind of this path to where I was like, I just started questioning everything in the book then. But if I had gone in knowing like, hey, this is a largely fictionalized account of the life of Cyrus, I think that just would have helped me prepare better for the work as it is. Despite that, just incredible stories and wise advice, and just interesting things to ponder, especially when you think that this book is almost 2,400 years old. I would, if you read this, I would approach it as more of wisdom literature, as more of a novel, as more of a fictional account, rather than something that's historically accurate. But within that, there's a lot of benefits in reading this work. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you, especially if you have read The Education of Cyrus by Xenophon. Let me know if I missed anything. Please comment on Substack, because then other people can see that comment. We can get a discussion going there. That'd be wonderful. I'm currently in my summer break now. This book by Xenophon was the last one for the Immortal books in my spring semester, which runs from March through June. So now that we're in July, I'm in my summer break. So I take 1 month where I just read books that are on the to be read pile and ones that have come up and just I want to read, but they are not in that chronological order of Immortal books. So here's what I have on the list for July. We'll see how many I get to these of these. But the first one is The Library of Ancient Wisdom, and this was a book that was sent to me, and it just came out this year. But it talks about the library of Ashurbanipal of Assyria, and so that'll be cool. We get like the Epic of Gilgamesh from this library, and I'm looking forward to learning about the history of that. I at some point I want to read a book about the library in Alexandria as well, but those two libraries were huge in ancient times. The library of Ashurbanipal and then the library of Alexandria in Egypt. So the second book is The Logic of Tragedy, and this is by Philip Vellicott, and he's done some of the translations of the Greek tragedies that I've read. But this book, the subtitle is Morals and Integrity in Aeschylus's Oresteia. So I loved the Greek tragedies, and this book was recommended to me as kind of digging in deeper to those. The third book is The Idea Machine by Joel J. Miller. He is a friend and local author here, and he wrote a book about books, and so about the actual physical book and how it changed over time and how we have it now. The next one is The Picture of Dorian Gray, and that's the book that I am leading the short great books reading group. So each month we read one short great book, and we meet in person in Franklin, Tennessee, if you live here, but we also do online call as well over Zoom. So if you'd like to join that, all you have to do is become a paid subscriber on Substack, and then you'll get the Zoom call information. But The Picture of Dorian Gray is the book that we're reading in July, and that'll be the third week in July. That'll be a fun one to discuss. Then I'm going to finish reading An Odyssey by Daniel Mendelsohn. So this is the latest translator of the Odyssey, but he wrote a book before he translated the Odyssey called An Odyssey, and it's a story of his father and him, but kind of told through the epic of the Odyssey. So I started it. We had Daniel Mendelsohn at Landmark Booksellers a few weeks ago, and so I started reading that before he arrived, but I didn't finish it before the event, but I do want to finish the book. And then the last one, if I get to it, is Myths from Mesopotamia. So this is one that the Epic of Gilgamesh is in there, but there's a number of other works from ancient Mesopotamia that I've not read yet and just would like to read. It also has the creation epic and some other famous stories from that time. So that's what I've got on the list. As you can see, a lot of it relates to the Immortal books, the great books. I can't get too far away with them from them. It's funny, the other day I started reading a more modern book, and I couldn't do it. It just, like, these Immortal books are so exciting and they are so good that and I hadn't really had this experience yet to where I read something newer and it just didn't do it for me, and so I had to put that book down. But yeah, I'm just, as the more I read of these Immortal books, the more I want to know about them. But with my reading plan of reading through the Immortal books, I don't have a whole lot of time within that to go down rabbit holes. So I'm using this summer break month to go forward with some of those rabbit trails. So we'll see what happens. I'll probably cover a lot of these on the podcast. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. Check out my website for book lists, reviews, all that kind of thing, how to create your own reading list. And then my Substack for Books of Titans, where I release all podcast episodes, and then on Fridays and then on Tuesdays, I release an article about reading or about a certain book. next week I'll be back with another episode. And until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.